Great. So last week we began to talk about the sort of the beginning of the end. And the beginning of the end is beginning of chapter 8. We read the first verse of chapter 8. We said, God remembered Noach. Elokim et Noach. God remembered Noach and all the beasts and all the cattle and were with him in the ark. And God caused the spirit to pass over the earth and the waters subsided. So we discussed what does memory mean? What does it mean that God remembered, as opposed to God, what is the opposite? In other words, up till now, he forgot the people. That's very difficult to say. You can't say it about God. So we mentioned the Kabbalistic interpretation, which says that the opposite of forgetting is not, the opposite of memory is not forgetting. God doesn't forget, but the opposite of memory is something that is insignificant. If it's insignificant, you don't remember. And when you say Elokim, the attribute of justice, of justice or God, but the attribute of justice remembers Noach, all of a sudden, Noach and the animals become very significant to God, and he remembers them. In other words, he wants a relationship with them, even though when something is infinite, you wouldn't expect the infinite to want a relationship with the finite. But just like it was in the beginning of creation, here too, God wants a relationship with the finite, and therefore he remembers, meaning the finite, the individual, the person, the creation, the animals, all of a sudden are significant before God. They become significant, they are significant before God, which is unnatural. And that's when the tide, pun intended, the tide turns, the spirit passes over the earth and the waters subside. So that's what we discussed last week on verse number 1 of chapter 8. That discusses the remembrance. By Yizkor Elokim et Noach, we also said that that's what we on Rosh Hashanah when we evoke God's the verses of memory. The Musaf of Rosh Hashanah is comprised of 3 parts. There's Malkit, we read verses of kingship, then we read verses of memory, and then verses of shofar, and the same idea of memory. And we can actually quote these verses about God remembering Noach in the ark, and we think about that. Again, we want that our actions in our life should be significant before God, and therefore God should bless us. So that's the memory. Okay, what does God remember? So God remembers Noach, of course. It doesn't say his family, but it says Noach, and then it says the beasts and the cattle that were with him in the ark. So it's almost like you're making that there's an equivalence between God's remembering of Noach and the animals. So it's almost like the animals and the human being is the same. So the commentaries try to deal with this a little bit. And for example, Nachmanides addresses the fact that it doesn't say Noach's children. You would expect if it says the beasts and the cattle that were with him in the ark, it's getting more specific. Beasts and cattle, you would say Noach and his family. No, it doesn't say his family, it says Noach. So what does that get Nachmanides to say? So Nachmanides says you have to differentiate between the memory of Noach and the memory of the animals. When God remembers Noach, the memory is what Nachmanides calls bischut, because of their merit. In other words, he's remembering the morality of Noach. Noach is worthy of being saved because he's a moral person, a righteous man. If that's the case, if that's why he's remembering Noach because of Noach's morality, then there's no point, then we don't mention Noach's family, because he proves this point elsewhere. Noach's family were only saved in the merit of Noach, right? So when it talks to the human being, it says God remembers the one who's worthy of being saved, the one who's moral. Who's that? Noach. You're not going to mention his family because his family are sort of just an extension of his. They were only saved because of him. When it comes to the animals, by contrast, they were not saved because of their moral choice, because animals don't have moral choice. So what did God remember? God remembers, in the language of Nachmanides, God remembers his words in the beginning of creation. God who desires a world, and God desires all the biodiversity. So in other words, God obviously, if he creates creations because he loves all his creations, but that is not because of merit, and therefore it mentions the animals. But that explains why it doesn't mention Noach's family, because Noach's family are sort of included within Noach, because that is a question of Noach was saved for a different reason than the animals were saved. So that is one interpretation. Then there's another beautiful interpretation from the Medrash. The Medrash says like this. The Medrash describes that there's a conversation between, later on in next week's Parsha, after the battle of the 4 kings and the 5 kings, that's going to happen between Abraham. Abraham supports the 5 kings against the 4 kings, and Abraham is victorious. So Abraham goes to a place called Shalem, which we believe is Yerushalayim, even though it doesn't say Yerushalayim clearly in the 5 books of Moses. It does say it in the Bible many times, but not in the 5 books of Moses. So it says Malkit Zedek, Melech Shalem Hotzi Lechem Bayayin. Malkit Zedek, the king of Shalem, brought bread and wine to Abraham, and they have a conversation. So Malkit Zedek, the king of justice. Okay, so obviously we're saying, in contrast to the other kings in town, Malkit Zedek was a righteous king or a ruler. He was really, they called him a king, but he really was a Kohen. He was a priest. It says, V'hu Kohen Le'el Elyon, he was a priest to God. Now, the Medrash says that Malkit Zedek is really Shem, the son of Noach. Now, I don't know if it means literally the exact son, because then he had to live very long. Maybe it means a descendant, but that's the tradition. That's what the Medrash says. Abraham meets the son of Noach, Shem, the son of Noach, who is, by the way, his great-grandfather, of course, because Abraham is a Semite, which means he comes from Shem. So the Medrash records a conversation. The Medrash says, if you meet Shem, what do you want to know from Shem? How was life? How were things before the war? How was life on the Teva? How was life on the Ark? But more specifically, I'm just quoting the Medrash. The Medrash says, how did you leave the Ark? In other words, with what? The Medrash says, how do you leave the Ark? Which probably means, with what merit did you leave the Ark? How did you? God remembered Noach and the animals. So it's like something happened to trigger God's memory, so to speak. Something happened to make God realize that the human being and their sacrifices and their life is significant. What happened? What happened on the Ark? So Malki Tzedek, literally the king of justice, but Tzedek in Hebrew, tzedakah, justice and charity is the same word. That's another discussion. But Malki Tzedek could be read the king of justice and the king of charity. So the Medrash says, Malki Tzedek says, how did we leave the Ark? Why did we leave the Ark? In the merit of the tzedakah, in the merit of the charity. That's what the Medrash says. So Abraham says, charity. What kind of charity do you have on the Ark? There's no poor people there. I don't know if there was emails from different appeals coming in on the Ark, but in any case, there were no poor people. Right, you know the joke. The joke is that there was a boat that got stranded in some little island in the Pacific, and everybody else on the island is very upset. They're lost and they're never going to be found. And the Jews there is very happy. He said, "What happened?" He says, "I once gave a donation to a Jewish organization. Believe me, they're going to track me down right here, and they're going to find me on this island in the Pacific." So what's happening here is that Abraham tells the son, Hashem, the son of Noach, what kind of charity did you do on the Ark? There's no poor people. So he says like this. He says the charity was for the animals. We did not sleep. All we did, we had to feed all the animals, and there was a tremendous amount of giving on the Ark, because Noach and his sons had to feed all the animals. Full-time job, 24/7. So the Medrash says when Abraham hears this, he says, look, if these people, in other words, Noach and his sons, merit to be saved from the flood and to leave the Ark because of the charity with animals, how much more so is it important to do charity? I don't know how much more so, but he says, I'm going to do that charity with human beings. And at that point, he goes and he opens up his famous inn in Be'er Sheva. Vayita Eshel Be'er Sheva. The verse says that he built a Eshel, which is an inn in Be'er Sheva in the south of Israel with a desert, and that's where he fed the people, and that's where he spread the knowledge of the one God. In other words, what the Medrash is doing is saying Abraham's kindness, the fact that Abraham was kindness and goes out to the place with his need, and he seeks to host the people traveling through the desert, that is really a motivation. He learns this from the kindness of Abraham of Noah and his children on the flood. Now, you could say, very nice Medrash, Abraham learned kindness from his great-grandfather, it's wonderful. Or you could say it's a little bit deeper than that. If you go back to the verse, and you can, the Medrash doesn't say this clearly, but I think this is what the Medrash is saying. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. If you want to think in the light of the Medrash, God remembers the kindness that Noah does to the beasts and to the cattle, and therefore, even God, by Yizkor Elokim, we discussed this in the past, that God, the attribute of judgment, says that Noah is worthy of being saved because of the charity, because of the kindness that Noah is showing to the animals. And going back to the Medrash, when it says, how did you leave the ark? It means, how are you rebuilding the earth? What experience are you taking with from the ark? You see, when we'll read about this later, I don't know if the doctor's on here, Dr. Beth is here, I don't think she is, but in any case, we'll read about this later, that there's a terrible trauma. If you're on the ark and you're saved and everybody else and the whole world is destroyed, well, at a minimum, you need some serious therapy, which Noah doesn't have. And therefore he ends up in some trouble down the road. But the problem here is, even before we get to the trauma, before we get to how this plays out, but you need, what experience are you taking from the traumatic event? And of course, it's not simple because there's all kinds of experiences that come along, as we will see, they all surface later. But what the Medrash is saying is what Shem, the son of Noah, tells Abraham. The experience that we take from the ark to go and rebuild the world is the experience of the kindness, and we're really going to rebuild the world with kindness. If you're going to rebuild the world with kindness, even the attribute of justice agrees that there should be the tide should turn, so to speak, and the waters should begin to subside, and we can start looking for the way out. And that's what happens. And verse 2 and 3 describe how the water stops raining, and the rain from the heavens, all the springs of the deep were closed, and the windows of the heavens and the rain from the heavens were withheld, and the waters begin to diminish after 150 days, after half a year. Okay, go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, I have a question. What if God, why does it say that God remembered? What if he didn't remember, so he would let him float forever?
Maybe. In other words, if the world is not significant, what is a premise of Judaism is that this hashgacha, this providence. Providence means that it's not just that God creates the world in the beginning, and then after that, he lets the world just float, and he found something better to do. Like many of the Greek philosophers believed that this God is the prime cause and the prime mover, but after that, he's not interested in what happens in the world. And the world is just really playing out the laws of nature, but there's no divine providence. And here we're saying, no, if Noah is to be saved, it's because something happens within God. God remembers, God, all of us, like we said, God remembers is synonymous with God, finds significance, and therefore wants to intercede and intervene and help them and help them rebuild the world. So this is clearly indicating that the rebuilding of the world, it's not like God created the world the first 7 days, and then now, after the flood, the human being creates the world. No, it is also that here too, it could not have been done without without God's providence and participation, so to speak.
Right, but wasn't that the initial plan to save the Noah's family? So eventually he will remember.
Yes.
Even if they didn't feed the animals.
That's a good point. That's a good point. The plan was to save them, but maybe the plan was to wait for a moment where they're worthy of being saved. Because what we're trying to do here, as we see, Rashi pointed out earlier, that Elohim remembered Noah, the righteous could transform the attribute of justice to mercy. In other words, what God wants here is that the human beings should express within themselves a reason to make God find significance and find pleasure within the world. We'll talk about this later, but the Kabbalists describe that the first generations, in the beginning of creation, the world is created by God's kindness. And after that, God doesn't want that anymore. God wants the human beings, the creation, to sort of earn what they're going to get. And that's why this explains many things. For example, one of the ideas that if you read the story, you read that the first generations lived very long, right? Why did they live so long? The Talmud asks, why did they live so long? And the Talmud answers, they lived so long because they sustained themselves from the kindness of Hashem. In other words, the model then was, it's like a parent giving a child when the child's very young, you're living on your child's on the parent's credit card. So it's not so, it doesn't really matter. You're 3 years old, doesn't really matter if you're deserving or you're not deserving. But then you get to a certain point and the plan is that God says, okay, I want to help you. I want to remember you. I want to let you out of the ark. I want to rebuild the world, but I want to see that you are deserving. And Elohim could say, the attribute of justice could say, now this action that you did is significant. So it shouldn't only be from the parent top down, but it should be a relationship. And that's the model of all of creation. But you see it playing out here very clearly.
Yeah, thank you. So Hashem had faith in Noah and was sure that eventually he will show some reason to be remembered.
Right. So so Chabad of Greenwich every year used to do a parenting conference. And every year they would bring the experts and teach the parents how to parent. And I never understood this. I would say, instead of giving me all your theories, come to my house for one night and let's see if your theories pan out. Very easy to speak in the lecture hall about parenting. One night in my house would put you to the test. But in any case, one thing that I remember of all the years is that somebody said, it was a good word, it was a good idea. He says, you have to, some people catch their kids making trouble. He says, you have to catch your kid doing something right. And instead of, right, your child needs reinforcement. So you wait for him to do something good. When he does something good, he doesn't even realize. You catch him and say, identify, say, wow, I'm so proud of you because of what you did. So you have to catch them for doing something right. When I read this verse, I say, God is finally, he's waiting. Fine. Yes, humanity did something right. God could remember Noah and say, okay, it's been 150 days. You've been serving the animals. We caught you doing something right.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have an evolutionary question. Assuming that Adam was perfection, and up till Noah, you see the de-evolution of man till the flood, are we, as we juxtapose Shem with Abraham, are we supposed to now think that there is now an evolutionary trend to a better man, and that it's from perfection to de-evolution? Are we now going the other way? And if so, one would think that we peaked at Moshe Rabbeinu and then have fallen off the cliff after that.
Right. So the short answer is yes. The short answer is we're evolving, not devolving. Even though in one sense we're devolving, but truly we're evolving. But to explain that, I need 60 seconds. So we had, so I need maybe 120 seconds, but we'll go for 60. Yeah, we think of evolving or devolving as sort of there's two dimensions of evolving or devolving. And the Kabbalah puts it, the way the Kabbalah puts it, it's really, the question is, are you going from above to below or below to above? In other words, when you talk about Adam was perfection, you're right. But Adam was perfection because it was gifted from above. In other words, it wasn't by his own effort. So in the model of Kabbalah, it's top down. Top down will be perfection, but by definition, it's not going to last. Because if you're giving to somebody, they're not earning it, it's not going to work. So was Adam perfection? Yes. Did Adam fail? Yes. Is that a contradiction? No. Perfection, top down, is not going to work in the long run. The flood begins the process of evolution from below to above. Could the human being elevate themselves? And in that sense, we're going to get a lesser product. We're never going to be like Adam. When you from bottom up, you could never get to the same space that you got from top down. However, it's more meaningful and more everlasting. So the metaphor that the Kabbalah would give is as follows. If you have two students, one student has an unbelievable teacher and is very capable of listening and accepting and writing down and remembering what the teacher said. And that student is unbelievable because he's got all the wisdom. The problem for that student is because it's given to him from the teacher, if the teacher, for whatever reason, takes a break or goes away from Memorial Weekend, at that point, the teacher, the student is not capable of growing or creating his own wisdom, because what he's good at is accepting the gifts from above. On the other hand, you have another student or another person who is able to create wisdom on their own. Now, they'll not be able to create the same level of wisdom as the wisdom that the other student gets from the teacher, but it can self-generate. And if it can self-generate, then no matter where you are, you can self-generate and self-correct. And that's the model post the flood, which is really why God says no more. There's not going to be any longer a need to create the flood, to bring another flood, because it's a different model now. But we'll get to that when we get to the rainbow. So that's the short answer. Now, within that, we also have sort of what looks like ups and downs. And you say Moshe is the peak of what a person could achieve from after the flood, and from then we are devolving, which is true in one sense. But again, following that same model, Moshe too gets gifts from above. He gets prophecy, and we had the whole JLI class on Tuesday, and we track all of Jewish history. And here comes the Kabbalistic catch. The Kabbalistic catch is, ironically, exile, where there's darkness, where you don't have prophecy, where you have challenges. And if you then could connect to God in the midst of the darkness, in a sense, you are more evolved. Because again, what are we looking for? We're not looking for who has more wisdom, who's more connected to God, who has more prophecy. A lot of that is gifts from above. What we're looking for is who could self-generate, who can create who can create light from amidst the darkness. And if that's what the purpose of creation is, then in one sense, we have devolved. We're not as great as the previous generations. The Talmud says that there's Yeridat HaDorot, there's a descent of generations. By definition, we're never going to be as great as the earlier generations. But that itself is not necessarily a problem. That itself means that in some sense, we're greater. Because if we're greater, is because we can produce light in the midst of the darkness, which is going to appear today in this chapter. That's the story according to some readings, of the dove and what the dove brings back to Noah. So part of the story with sending away the birds is really Noah trying to figure out what type of world are we entering now. And maybe the message is we're entering, I'll give it away right now, why not? She comes with an olive branch. What's an olive branch? Ale zayit, not an olive branch, an olive leaf. What's an olive leaf? So somehow the olive became a symbol of peace. It's not necessarily peace. Different commentaries say different things. Some people say independence. The Kabbalistic commentaries, for example, the Kli Yakar says, no. What is he telling you? He's telling you your job is to be like the olive. You have to produce light. You press the olive, you get the olive oil, and when does he come to him? The olive branch comes to Noah, the olive leaf comes to Noach le'et erev, in the evening. Okay, so here's the metaphor. You're Noah. You say that the world has obviously become a dark place because to the extent that the world had to be destroyed by the flood. And then and you send out the birds, you send out the feeler to figure out what's going to happen in this world. What's the message? How do we go forward? And then what does the bird come back with? When? In the evening. And he says it's evening, but you have the olive leaf. You have the ability to produce light specifically in the darkness. And in that sense, you may be greater than Moses, and you may be greater than Abraham, and maybe greater than, well, Abraham is the beginning of the model. I don't want to say Abraham, but you see what I'm saying? Abraham was also self-generated, self-made man. He discovers God on his own. But again, when you look at the question of are we evolving or devolving, you have to look at it in a complex way. It's not just the question of who's more spiritually sensitive. It's also a question is what are the external environment and what is the circumstances and what is the situation within the world? And in that sense, our little bit of light in the moment of darkness could be more valuable and more moving the purpose of creation forward even more than a greater amount of light in the times of the temple. So that's the story in short. A lot more to say, and I'm sure we'll say it when we get to the rainbow and in general. But this is a big shift. It's a big shift of a question of it's not about how close you are to God. It's about is it above to below? Is it below to above, etc. As we like we began to talk about. So I hope this
Beautiful answer. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Jill. Please go ahead.
Okay. Rabbi, I'm questioning the metaphor of Adam. Is it the Adam of creation that was both male and female? Is that the perfect Adam? Or is the Adam that ate the fruit of the tree that he shouldn't have, who is not the perfect Adam, but do we say he's the perfect Adam? So who's our original metaphor?
Well, original metaphor is the perfect Adam would be Adam and Eve together. They separate, but even in the Garden of Eden, remember, we can go back and unpack the Garden of Eden. We'll be here all day. We'll be here for the next 32 minutes discussing the Garden of Eden. If you want to go short, but the point here is, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, if you're God, you should be very frustrated, right? Think about God's perspective. You create the garden, you have two people, you say, all you have to do is make your bed in the morning. In other words, there's one mitzvah, right? You take your kids on vacation and say, I'm going to cook all the food. I'm going to do the grill. I'll worry about the sailboat. I'll do everything. All you have to do is make your bed in the morning, okay? And you're trying to create this perfect harmonious situation, and it fails. And that's what the Garden of Eden. And in other words, you're asking, where was the breakdown? Good question. At some point, the breakdown was from Adam and Eve as complete to where there's tension between the two of them. That's an important question. But I'm saying, let's go even broader. Let's think about the broader picture here. The broader picture is God wants serenity and peace, and it doesn't work. So it's a failure. So the Kabbalah says it's not a failure. It's bound to happen. It has to happen. Why? Because you cannot give your kids or anybody else serenity or perfection. It just doesn't work. You can give them a taste. Then they're going to say, okay, now we want to try to do this for ourselves. And that's why they rebel, either when they're teenagers or when they're younger, it doesn't matter, or when they're older. Some people are late blossoming teenagers. That's why they're going to rebel. And they're going to say, look, we like the serenity. Don't get us wrong. We like floating on a sailboat. But we have to get there on our own. If we get it from you, it's pointless. And at some point, they're going to say, okay, the one rule you said is make our bed. Okay, we're not making our bed. Let's see what happens then. And that's the breakdown. So the breakdown would be, again, because they're gifted, at some point they're not going to want that they're not going to want that serenity. And that's what Eve says. Eve says, this is beautiful to the eyes. What is the challenge, the temptation, right? She's attracted to the challenge. Attracted to the challenge. God, the parent, is working so hard to give you serenity and peace. I'm trying to shield you from any difficulty, right? That's what parents do. Right? If you're a parent here, that's what you do. You don't want your kids to have any challenge. Of course, it's very good when they're 1 year old, 2 years old. After that, it just doesn't work. They're going to seek it out. If you don't give them any area where they could learn to fail and learn to be disappointed and learn to overcome the disappointment, ultimately they're going to do it for themselves. So, in short, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, as otherwise Genesis is a very sad book. It's a very depressing book. It's basically saying that even human beings who have everything are ultimately going to reject God and are going to sin, and we're terrible people. And people who read that book basically say we can't help ourselves, and therefore, therefore we need to be saved, right? And that's why at least Catholicism read the book and they say the takeaway from the story is that we can't help ourselves and we need to be saved. And of course, Judaism's reading is no, that's not the takeaway. The takeaway here is that we need to do this on our own. We need to create the serenity and the peace in the world on our own, not being saved from above. If we're going to be saved from above, that's going back to the Adam model. That's not going to work. So you see what's happening here. We're having the exact opposite reading, and we get to the exact opposite effect. And this is deep. I didn't think about this, but I like this. This is a good word. This is nice. Right? We come to the exact, the other faiths are saying the takeaway is you need to be saved from above. That's the takeaway. And what we're saying is, no, the takeaway is God can't do it for you. You need to be in exile. In other words, the whole purpose is human beings are not transformed until there's darkness, and they learn to bring light from the olive branch when? La'et Erev, in the evening, in the darkness. And that's the takeaway of the story. And in that sense, like Bob says, we are evolving, even though to evolve, we have to devolve. In other words, that's the catch here. We have to be in a darker spot. We have to be more distant and less sensitive to spirituality to be able to advance the cause of creation, which is refining the human being. So we're not better than the previous generations in the sense we're not closer to spirituality. There is a descent of the generations, but that's the point of creation. The point is, despite this descent, could we still produce the light? And if we can, then we achieve much more, because the transformation takes place and is internalized. And that's why if you look at Jewish history, the good times don't last. In other words, the blessings that come from above don't last. But the creations, ultimately the creations that we create during exile, the transformation that happens through exile, in some sense, is actually a deeper transformation. Don't tell this to some Okay, some people get offended by what I just said, so keep it here between us. No, I'm kidding. In other words, some people, I'm referring to the Zionism. Zionism tried to, secular Zionism tried to wipe away the exile. They have this, Ben-Gurion had, Ben-Gurion had a, I don't know if it was him or his students had a phrase that they wanted to create Jewish history. They would call it Mehatanach la Palmach. From the Tanakh to the Palmach. What's the Palmach? Palmach was the elite unit of the Haganah. So in other words, we're going from the fighters of the Bible to the fighters of the modern Zionistic movement, and the 2,000 years of Jewish history in between, they thought as a distraction. Of course, that's a mistake, because in some sense, what formed the Jewish people even more than a time of on the land of Israel is the Jewish people within exile. And that in the times of darkness and the what we can create, we were able to produce in the realm of Torah study, in the realm of of philosophy, in the realm of trying to become closer to Hashem and become better people, in that sense, that perhaps had a deeper impact on our psyche, collective psyche, than even the time of the land on the Tanakh. What I just said is heresy for some people, like I said. So, like I said, don't put it in the New York Times, but this is what I believe. So if you put it in the New York Times, I won't be that upset.
Rabbi, I have another question about the word remember.
Please,
Because
go ahead.
we know that God's nose doesn't burn, and if we understand that God doesn't remember as human beings remember. And you explained it as our experience of his recognizing the merit of whoever it was. So I just have an issue with the word remember. And I wonder if there's another word in Hebrew that would more describe what God is doing versus how we experience it.
So again, I think that from the Kabbalistic perspective, Yizkor means to remember, means to find significance. That's the way you have to read.
All
Because
right.
even like I said, I always say this story. I'm still traumatized when I was in the first grade and a kid came to school and he said, I forgot my homework. And the teacher said, did you forget your pants? And no, it's a very serious point. It's a serious point is what's significant, you don't forget. If you forgot it, it's not significant. So when you say Yizkor, memorial prayer for your relatives, what do you say? Yizkor Elokim et Nishmat. May God remember the soul of who? What does that mean? May God remember the soul. God forgot? What, there's a problem in the database? The data centers are down? What does it mean forget? So again, Yizkor means find significant. Understand and realize, again, remember God is infinite. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, for God, who's infinite, to find meaning and find pleasure and find purpose within the experience of the human being is something that we have to elicit within God. And that's what we pray. That's the memorial prayer, and that's what God, and that's what the human beings who elicits it. By the way, the Kabbalah is very big into this about Rosh Hashanah. That's really what we're doing Rosh Hashanah. If you want the Kabbalah of Rosh Hashanah, is we take the shofar and we cry to God and we remind him to think about us, remind him to remember us. What does it mean? Yes, if we create within him the desire to find significance within us by us desiring a relationship with him. So here the point is it's not a question of remember. Like I said, we like to think of in our mind, because of our human experience where we are susceptible to forget. So for us, the contrast of remember, the opposite of remember is forget. But if forgetfulness is off the table, there's no such thing as forgetfulness, as we say in the prayer. I think it's from a verse in the Bible. There is no forgetfulness before the throne of your glory. So forgetfulness is not an option. So then now we have to rethink. So then if it says remember, what does remember mean? If it says if forgetfulness is not an option, then remember means the opposite. Like I said, remember means significant, and the opposite of remember is it's insignificant, which is it's understood not because God's a bad guy, but because he's infinite.
By the word remember, if you take it apart, it lists in English, is to reattach, to reconnect.
Very good point. Good point. I'll make the argument that with God, we're always attached. In other words, there's always, we owe it to exist in this world. We always have to have the divine energy within us. In other words, we're always connected. The problem here is the challenge is not that we're not connected. The challenge is that we're finite and God is infinite. That's the challenge. And therefore, the big news is The big news is that God remembers us and wants a relationship with us. And that has to be recreated from anew again. Again, like I said, the Kabbalah says the whole idea of Rosh Hashanah is every year God questions his desire, his desire to have a relationship with the finite, right? Why would he, right? If you look at an ant colony, it's very entertaining for about 5 seconds, and then you move on because there's a lot going on there and they work very hard and there are all kinds of interesting things, but you have you have other things to think about. And of course, the gap between the finite and the infinite is much greater than the gap between the human being and the ant colony, right? So again, it's a constant need for us to awaken within God the desire to have a relationship with us. And in the Kabbalists say that is exactly what Rosh Hashanah is, and that's why we sound the shofar, et cetera, et cetera. And all the rituals of Rosh Hashanah now would be explained and make sense in the light of this Kabbalistic idea that the desire to create the world ascends within God because God is infinite, and we have to recreate that desire. And that's what's happening here, because in some sense, God's recreating the world after the flood. It's a creation. It's a second creation in some sense.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on your previous point about the God remembered the not his family. It's because now the emphasis is more about personal responsibility and personal connection, and that's what Hasidism is also all about, just finding your own connection to Hashem.
Yeah,
is at the beginning of the new kind of model.
I think so. I think you're right. Okay, we got to go back to the verses a little bit because you're going to go off the call and someone's going to ask you, what did you study today? And say, nothing, we didn't study any verses. So we got to go back, study some Torah Sunday morning. Okay. So I don't want to get into the dates, exactly what happens. In short, they're for 150 days, the water is raging. After 150 days, the water starts receding. And eventually they land on the Mount of Ararat, verse 4. And the ark came to rest in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. So a few points here. First of all, there's a big debate in the Talmud when the flood began, which then, in other words, all these dates can be read two ways. In other words, it started raining on the second month. What is the second month, right? Does it say it here? Yeah, in the previous chapter. Chapter 7, we have the dates. Here. In the 600th year of Noah's life, chapter 11, and chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on this day, all the springs of the great deep were split, and the windows of the heavens are opened up. Okay, so it's the second month. What is the second month? Is it the second month from Tishrei, second month after Rosh Hashanah? In other words, Rosh Hashanah being the first month, Tishrei being the first month, and the second month being Cheshvan, which is the season of the rain, by the way, in Israel. Cheshvan, the second month, as Cheshvan, the second month right after the high holidays, right after Tishrei. Or is the second month, or are we counting from Nisan? Because later, once the Torah is given, once God gives the Jewish people the calendar, so we start counting the months from Nisan, for the month of the spring, from the season of the spring, from the month of Passover. And then the second month would be Iyar, would be the month after Passover. And there's a big debate in the Talmud, Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and that will therefore inform all the following dates that appear, that mention, like I said, in this, we just read the 7th month. The 7th month, it depends. The 7th month is either the month of Tishrei, or if you count from, if you want to count from Tishrei, then the 7th month is Iyar. So, like I said, there's a dispute, which I think there's also spiritual ramifications for this dispute, but that's another story. I think I haven't seen this written clearly, but I really think there could be many spiritual ramifications of this dispute, in the sense that what is the we have two ways of counting. We count the natural cycle from Rosh Hashanah. We count the spiritual and miraculous cycle from Nisan. And the question is, so what is the energy that is dominant during the flood? Is it the natural or the supernatural? So I think that's really the reason behind this debate. But in any case, when we read, it's interesting that on the fourth day, on the ark came to rest in the seventh month, on the 7th day of the month. There's a Kabbalistic commentary, 16th century in Tzfat, who says the Teva rests on the 7th month. The 7th month to us is the month, if you count according to that we begin in Nisan, the 7th month is the month of the high holidays. So this too, in other words, God remembers us in the 7th month, right? When we sound the shofar, that is God remembering the people, and that's why it happens in the 7th month. So he doesn't really explain what's the 17th of the month. It's possible the 17th is the numerical value of good. I just pulled it out of the hat. But in other words, he does address the concept that here, like I said before, that God remembers Noach, and we evoke that on Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah is the concept of memory, right? We even say in our prayers, the Torah says, Yom HaZikaron. Remember that the Torah does not refer to Rosh Hashanah as the new year. That's the rabbinic name for the holiday. The biblical name of the holiday is B'Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembrance, right? So here you see the 7th month is when the remembrance comes about, in the sense that, yes, it's the beginning of the rehabilitation, and the ark rests on the Mount of Ararat. Now, where is Ararat? So all the scholars discuss where Ararat is. It's in Turkey somewhere. Maybe Bob knows a little bit more, sort of the border of Turkey and Armenia. That's Ararat. If you want to go a little bit more mystical, and some of the Kabbalists discuss this, they say the word Ararat in Aramaic means curse. Okay, you can read this. The Teva rests on the 7th month, in the 17th month, on the cursed mountains. In other words, what was cursed about the earth? What was cursed about the earth is after the sin of the tree of knowledge. God tells Adam, "Aruraha adama ba'avurecha." The earth is cursed on your behalf, or because of you. And what we're going to see later is that after Noach offers the offerings, as he does in a few verses, God says, "Lo osif od lekalel et ha'adama." I will no longer continue to curse the earth, or curse the earth once again. Kabbalistically, this can be read, no longer is the earth cursed. Why? Like we said earlier, said last week and the previous weeks, that Kabbalistically speaking, the waters of the flood are also waters of purity. So in other words, the cursed earth from Adam is no longer cursed. And it alludes, that's what God is going to say. So the contrast here you have the Teva landing in the 7th month on the mountains that were cursed. That's the earth that was cursed. But once the process is done, once the waters subside completely, once Noach offers the offerings, then no longer, as God will say, no longer is the earth cursed. Now you can read it as God says, "I will not curse the earth again." But if you read it literally, it's, "I will not continue to curse." And if he doesn't continue to curse, then the curse is no longer, then there's no longer a curse. So that's just interesting of how the Kabbalists are reading and finding in this verse 4, both the 7th month, the reference of Rosh Hashanah, of the 7th month of the high holidays, and the contrast that's going to take place as a result of Noach's offerings. Okay, so it continues to recede. Finally, 40 days later, it's not clear 40 days after what. 40 days after, the simple meaning is 40 days after it lands on the high mountains of Turkey, of Ararat, Noach opens the window of the ark that he has made. And he sent forth the raven, and it went out back and forth until the waters dried up off the earth. So now we have the strange story of the raven and the dove. And we'll just read a few verses, and it's not exactly clear what's happening here. It's not exactly clear what Noach is trying to do, or what the verse is trying to signal to us, but there are a few interpretations. Maybe we'll say one or two this week. Maybe we'll save some for next week. But first, let's read the verses. So what did we just read? Noach opens up the window. He sent forth the raven, and it went out back and forth until the waters dried up off the earth. Why does he send it? We don't know. Doesn't say why he sent it. Let's read verse 8. And he sent forth, it doesn't say why, it just says he sends the raven. It went out, it went back and forth until the waters dried up. It doesn't say why he sent the raven. Verse 8, and he sent forth the dove from with him, me'ito. Here, we all of a sudden, here we have what's the word I'm looking for? We have a reason, we have a mission that the dove was sent forth to see whether the waters had abated from upon the surface of the earth. So here we see two changes. The first change is he sent forth the raven. When it comes to the dove, he sent forth the dove from with him, me'ito, from with him. It's a much more expression of closeness. There's a certain intimacy between the man and the dove. You don't see that with the raven. That's the first change. The raven, it doesn't say from with him. It just says he sends the raven. And when it comes to the dove, he sends the dove from with him. First change. Second change is, doesn't say why he sends the raven. Now you say, well, I figure it out. If he sent the dove, doesn't say why he sent the raven. He just says he sends it, and the dove goes back and forth until the waters dried up. When it comes to the dove, it says why he sent him. He sent him to see if the waters abated from the earth. Now we know the story, but the dove found no resting place for the sole of its foot. So it returned to him to the ark because there was water upon the entire surface of the earth. So he stretched forth his hand and took it and brought it to him to the ark. You see that to him again, right? It's not just he brought it back to the ark. It brought it to him to the ark. Again, an expression of closeness between Noach and the dove, which we did not see with the raven. And he waited again another 7 days, and he again sent forth the dove from the ark. And the dove returned to him at eventide, and behold, it has plucked an olive leaf in its mouth. So Noach knew that the waters had abated from upon the earth. And he again waited another 7 days, and he sent forth the dove, and it no longer continued to return to him. And finally, when he realized that happened, that it's not coming back, and it came to pass in the 600th year, 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, that the waters dried up from upon the earth. And Noach removed the covering of the ark, and he saw, and behold, the surface of the ground had dried up. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. So if you remember, the day that the flood began on the seventh day, on the second month, on the 17th day. The flood ends on the second month, on the 27th day. So it's a year and 10 days. Why a year and 10 days? God couldn't round it off for a year. So the answer, of course, is it was a full year. It was a full solar year. The months are counted according to the lunar year. Now we know that the lunar year is about 10 and a half days shorter than the solar year. So that extra 10 days is because they were in the ark for a complete solar year. So that's an extra 10 days. Okay, so what do we see? Usually before we get to the, okay, so what do we see? What I would expect now is, and Noach got out of the ark. That's not what happens. What happens is, Noach doesn't leave the ark. And God spoke to Noach saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Okay, what's interesting about here? Why is Noach sending the dove? Well, he wants to see whether or not the water has abated. Why is he important to know? He's not going to leave the ark anyway until God commands him to. Okay, so that's an interesting question. It's like you wake up in the morning, the first thing you want to know is the weather. So Noach, human beings, that's the human beings. Human beings are curious creatures. It lands. He's very interested to know if the water has abated. But it's interesting that he's really not going to take any action based on this knowledge, right? Because even after it says the earth was completely dry, 1 year later, he's not going anywhere. There's no sign of movement until God tells him time to leave. Time to leave. So
Preparation.
okay, you want to
He
prepare.
wants time to prepare.
That's fine.
And what was the meaning? The understanding in Midrash about the raven?
So we'll get to that in a second. Before we get, I want to get to the big story. What's trying to happen? What's happening here? So some people believe that what's happening here is that even if we can't make the final move without God, but God wants us to prepare, like you say, but not just to prepare when to unpack, to stop packing the bags, but to do whatever we can to work toward the rebuilding of the earth, even though we need God's blessing. And you see Noach moving forward on both those avenues simultaneously. On one hand, he's preparing and planning as if he's the one to make the decision. On the other hand, he waits for God's directive. And this is really a sign that the rebuilding of the earth has to happen with human initiative. Remember, we discussed that it's critical for Noach to build the ark. It's critical for Noach to try to figure out what's the best time to leave the ark. Nevertheless, you need God's blessing, so he's not going to leave until God's blessing. But this involvement of Noach represents the idea that you need the human involvement, which is what we discussed earlier today, which is why I wanted to say it. Okay, what do we do with this Orev? They translate the raven. I don't know if it's the raven. I don't know, but it's the Orev. What do we do with this verse? This verse is very problematic. He sent forth. The reason why it's go ahead.
That's I have a question. It's kind of inconsistent because the raven was not coming back until the water subsided, but at the same time the dove, and so the raven was first to find out when the water subsided. But however, the dove was also sent. Yes. That's inconsistent.
Yes, and it's so inconsistent that you end up with Rashi quotes a very strange medrash. Okay. Let's read Rashi, very strange medrash. If there's a strange medrash, it's because it's a strange verse. And he sent forth the raven, and it went out back and forth until the water dried up on the earth. So I'm reading Rashi in verse 7. And it went out back and forth, going and encircling around the ark. But it did not go to fulfill its errand, because the raven suspected him, Noach, concerning its mate, as we find in the Haggadah of chapter Chelek, Tractate Sanhedrin. What Rashi is saying here is like this. Noach says, Mr. Orev, Mr. Raven, do me a favor. Could you go and check and fly out and check and see what's going on the earth? The Orev says, I'm not so stupid. The reason why you're sending me away is because you want to marry my mate. You want to marry Mrs. Orev. And that's why it didn't want to go. And it didn't want to go, and it stayed close to the ark. And when it says it went back and forth, means it's encircling the ark. That is what the Medrash says. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could make sense of this Medrash, I would be very happy this morning.
Rabbi, the raven, you have to ask what it meant in the society of the time.
Yes.
Because it's speaking in the language of the people.
Correct.
And a raven was never offered in the temple. Doves were offered in the temple for sacrifice. It was considered somehow kosher, holy, whatever. And ravens in other cultures were wise, were connectors to the spirits. So there was something else involved here.
Something
that
is
was never, just interesting that it was never explored.
Yes, so something is happening here, and that's why I hesitate to translate the word Orev as raven, because I don't know that it's a raven. But I'm just going to give you one more medrash just to confuse it, and then we'll try to make sense of this. The next medrash says that Noach sends away the raven. You know why? He doesn't say he sends him on a mission. He sent him. He didn't send him on a mission. Remember that verse 8 that's here on the screen. Verse 8, when it comes to the dove, it says he sends him to see whether the waters had abated from upon the surface of the earth. So he sends the raven, the dove, with a mission. The raven has no mission. It's almost like saying he's trying to get rid of the raven. He's trying to send him out of the ark, even without, not sending him for any purpose. So there's another medrash that says that if you look at between the lines, there's a commandment that the human beings on the ark, and therefore also the animals, should not engage in procreation on the ark. If you read the commandment, let's see if I can find it. If you read the commandment to enter the ark, look at, for example, verse 7, but it says it earlier as well, because God tells him, Noach went in, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives. So I read this verse. This verse seems very simple. The whole family got on. But the rabbis say, no, look at Rashi. The men separately and the women separately, because they were prohibited from engaging in marital relations since the world was steeped in pain. right? So it says Noach and his sons, and then his wife and his sons' wives. Okay, so that's the subtlety, and Noach gets it because that's God's commandment. God's commandment, God says the same expression. And only when they leave the ark, you will see that God says, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives, right? There's no separation between male and female. That means that they once again are permitted to engage in procreation. That is what the sages explain. Let's see if it's in this chapter or it's in the next chapter. It's the next chapter. We'll go to the next chapter. Chapter 9. No, it should have been in the previous chapter. Yeah, here we go. Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and your sons' wives with you. So it's you and your wife together, your sons and their wives together. There's no separation, male and female. So we know that the human beings and therefore the animals cannot procreate, which is also practical. The commentaries say, could you imagine if the animals will engage in procreation on the ark, there would be no room. Says the Medrash that the raven engages in procreation in the ark, and God is very upset, and Noach is very upset. So sort of to punish the raven, he sends off the raven. And this Medrash is interesting because what it does is for us, it explains why it doesn't say that Noach sends the raven on a mission. There's no mission. For the dove, there's a mission. On the raven, there's no mission. Okay. So in other words, it's a form of a punishment. He sends him away. He's trying to separate himself from the raven. And that's also explains the second point that we pointed out, that there's no closeness between the dove and the raven. When he sends away the dove, the dove, for example, it says he sends him from with him. Me'ito, from within, there's a closeness. But the raven he's trying to get rid of. So that's the Medrash. Again, what do I do with these Medrashim? What do they mean? So I don't know if the floor is open to interpretation. I'll give you one modern interpretation. You tell me if you like it or not. Jill wants to know, what does the raven represent in that culture? Now, I don't want to say raven because then I'm getting in trouble with the scientists. But according to rabbinic literature, there's no question that the raven represents cruelty, even cruelty to their family. There's a verse in Psalms that we say every day that God gives everybody sustenance, and it says Livnei Orev Asher Yikro, the sons of the Orev that call out to God. And the commentaries explain that why does it single out the children of the Orev? Let me see if I can find it here. Yes, so that's Psalms number 147. We say it every day. Let's see if I can. He gives to the cattle their food, to the young ravens which cry to him. Now again, I'm not saying it's a raven, but Livnei Orev, for the Orev. The commentaries say, why Orev? Why single out the Orev? Because the Orev is cruel and they don't take care of their children. Now, I don't know if this is true about the Orev or about any other bird or about the dove or about the raven. I don't know. That's not important. What's important is that's what it meant in that culture. So Orev is cruelty. The first thing Noach does. Okay, so now you could read this a few different ways. One way to read it is that Noach, how are we going to rebuild the earth? So if the Orev is cruelty, then the dove is kindness. The dove is closeness to the human being. The dove has a certain closeness. The dove represents kindness. Now, you can read this in two ways. I'll give you both options. One way to read it is that the dove is that Noach now wants to rebuild the world. He's going to send a mission. He's going to send a emissary to figure out if we can start the process of repopulating the earth. So what do you send? Which animal do you send? It says, which animal do you think, which attribute do you think should be dominant? And now you would think naturally that if the people sinned and we got to a point of where you get to the point where the world has reached such a state of corruption, you need strength, you need cruelty, you need to have law and order, not kindness. You need severity to be the dominant force. You need discipline to be a dominant force. And therefore Noach sends out the raven. The raven is the one who's going to be the first one to come out and see if we can repopulate the earth. But it fails. It doesn't work. He doesn't go anywhere. He stays close to the ark.
What is the raven in Egyptian culture?
I don't know. I don't know.
According to Uniguide, in fact, many were part.
Oi. Ask to mute. Okay. So what's happening here is like this. What's happening here is that Noach is thinks that you could begin the process of repopulating the earth with severity, with justice, with discipline, and it doesn't work. And what happens? He realizes that you need this concept of kindness, and to rebuild the earth, you need the kindness. And after trauma, when somebody experiences the trauma, sometimes it makes people more harsh, and it makes people less sensitive to other people. And that's the danger, and that's the fear. But what happens here with what the story is telling us, that you have to have the dove. Only the dove is the one that can repopulate the earth. Nevertheless, it does say that the Orev is circling. That's a very interesting verse. It doesn't say he doesn't want to go and he comes back. It says it's circling until the earth dries up. And one way to read this is you do need discipline, because just kindness is also not good, because just kindness, you become an enabler to the negativity. So you have to have the Orev, the attribute of discipline and I don't want to say cruelty, but discipline, hovering around to protect your kindness. But the goal is the kindness. So that's one interpretation. I'm sure there are many more. Maybe next week we'll do more. But since we're already way over time, we'll have to call it a day. If anyone has questions, comments, please share. But again, the question becomes, how do I rebuild? Do I rebuild primarily with discipline or primarily with kindness? And the discipline is just hovering above and around to protect the kindness. But the goal is the kindness. But you have
Rabbi,
to.
I just looked up the raven in Egyptian culture, and it was attributed. It was a symbol of death.
Symbol of death. Okay. So
That was in the Egyptian culture, but there were other cultures around with different connections.
Right, but when the Medrash is referring to the Orev, whatever the Medrash says about the Orev, it's clear that it's referring to cruelty. But cruelty is discipline. Cruelty is not a bad thing. Cruelty depends on how you use it. But cruelty means an iron fist. In other words, you're not going to feed your kids. Let the kids earn it on their own. That's the perspective of the Medrash on the Orev. So now when you read it, it says the first thing he sends out the Orev, that doesn't work. It fails. He can't even advance his mission with the Orev. So what does that tell you? That tells you have to build the world with kindness. You do have to have the Orev in the background, because again, the judgment, the discipline protects the kindness. Otherwise, you put the kindness in the wrong ways and you become an enabler to evil. But the goal is the kindness. Again, that's one interpretation. Hopefully next week we come back, we do more. And like I said, we already discussed the symbolism of the olive. We alluded to it, the olive branch. What Noach is being told by the dove is that, yes, the world may be dark, but your job is to bring the light specifically to the place of darkness, to the place of evening. And that's what we've been doing ever since, hopefully.
One question, Rabbi.
Please.
So raven is, my understanding, ravenous. And I think when he let the raven out, if the raven was able to find sustenance, he wouldn't have returned to the ark. And in view of the fact that he did return to the ark, it showed Noah that there was nothing out there for him to eat, and he came back because he was dependent on Noah for sustenance.
Yes. The commentary, the Medrash does say that the raven would eat the corpses, and therefore he wanted to figure out what is what's the state? Is it dry? Could you find at least the corpses of people and animals? That's the Medrash does mention that. Correct. Yes. Indeed.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful holiday, and we should see each other in good health. And the sun should come out, and we should be able to do barbecues, and because tradition is important.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about that interpretation? Where does it come from? Because it's a beautiful interpretation, and also kind of is in line with what the written Torah is saying. Because only the dove, the symbol of kindness, had the mission. Raven did not.
Right. So I heard this from a great sage named Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, who you know.
I see.
That's where I heard this.
So that's his personal or it's Kabbalistic?
This I don't know. Usually,
Okay.
if he would have said a source, I would have known. I would have written down the source, but I didn't write down the source. So it could be this is his distilling of the earlier Kabbalistic ideas in his own language. That's probably what it is. So it's probably
Yeah.
Kabbalistic ideas, but it's probably his way of presenting it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.
Good to see each other.
Have a good day, Rabbi.
Take care, Richard.
Thank-
Thank you for joining.
Have a good day, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Wonderful day.